Chris, who is the greatest saxophone player, jazz saxophone player of all time?
It's got to be Bill Evans,
Okay.
Charles Mingus,
Minkus, okay.
Louis Armstrong.
Could be Louis, could be. I think I think we got some work to do here, man.
All right, all right.
Hey, what is shaking, everybody? Welcome to the Spins Vinyl channel. This is a new podcast, video podcast called Outward Bound. We kind of took it from the Dolphy album, as I'm sure some of you well know. And so, yeah, Outward Bound conversations in jazz. We just wanted to hang out, talk a little bit about jazz, not get too stuffy about it. We don't have our pipes, we don't have our slippers. We're not doing that stuff. We just want to have fun with it. Just talk about, Chris and I want to get into, some of the music that we love and just share that stuff and talk a little bit about our history with jazz and hopefully introduce some of the people, the fine people, the vinyl community to some new music. So, this is the inaugural video podcast. Thank you so much for being here. Appreciate you, whether you're watching or listening later. Thank you. Let's have some fun. Chris, what's happening, man? How you doing?
I'm good for me, man. It's Monday. It's a good night for jazz, and I'm really excited to kind of introduce everybody to my journey and what I really like to know, Jason, because I find it interesting how people get to jazz or how they find jazz. What was your journey like? How did it enter your life?
So, I'm going to pretend like I didn't just have this conversation, but so for me, it started really early because, my parents listened to records since I was a baby, and outside of Grateful Dead albums, my dad would play 78 RPMs of jazz music and stuff like that. One of the ones that stands out most to me, and I've told the story before, is the ink spots. Someone's Rockin' My Dreamboat, made famous by Bugs Bunny in one of his cartoons where he's singing that tune. Which incidentally is kind of funny because early cartoons was kind of another way to get introduced to that stuff. They were always singing tunes from like the era and stuff. And a lot of that stuff was like, early big band jazz, kind of musical groups, singers and stuff like that. Anyway, I did pull a couple records aside here just to kind of step through this really quickly. The ink spots right there. We might as well show records. It is a vinyl channel after all. That's Golden Favorites. The original ink spots. Someone's Rockin' My Dreamboat is on here. It's a Decca. And this one's great, man. If you just want to kind of dip your toes in the water, on these early musical groups pre-doo-wop. This is before doo-wop, but it's very similar. You'll feel that this is kind of a precursor to that. And these guys started in like the mid 30s. So, real early, but it's fantastic. I have to break this out occasionally and just kind of, take myself back to that era. And then kind of the next step for me, actually getting into jazz proper, I guess. And I'll skip ahead. There's a lot of steps, but at some point in my, I think, in the mid to late 80s, I'm probably a teenager starting to, graduate high school and stuff. And I asked my dad, because I was really into big band music and I was into all that really old stuff. And I was like, what is this other stuff that I keep hearing? It feels like there's not as many instruments. It's kind of like there's a lot of trumpet and, different stuff. Like I had no clue. Like this is pre-internet. I didn't have any friends that like jazz. I was the only nutty kid in my circle that did. He goes, all right, go get a Miles Davis and a Thelonious Monk record. So I lived in the Bay Area in California. I'd go straight to Berkeley, which I frequented my whole teenage life. Went to the jazz section of like Rasputin's or Amoeba or something like that. Grabbed two records. They're right here. This is the first one, Miles Davis and the Modern Jazz Giants. By the way, I should say I'm very, very biased, as you can probably imagine, about these two, just because these are the two, man, that started it all for me on Prestige. It was probably OJCs that I picked up at that time, when they were just coming out. But that's the first one, Miles. And then I picked up one monk, and this is the monk I picked up with Sonny Rollins. And I'm telling you, there's a lot worse places you could start, when you're just kind of getting into jazz and kind of, lubing up the ears, so to speak, to get into that stuff. I think that was a great entry point for me. So anyway, cool stuff, man. What about you? How'd you start getting into jazz?
So I think I have a pretty unique path in that, like, my parents were definitely into music, but not kind of the nerd side like I am. I think they always had music on in the house. For those tuning in from the East Coast, they always were playing WCBS FM, which basically played, it was an oldie station, what we used to call an oldie station. So they would play a lot of Motown, funk, disco, obviously rock and roll, and things like that. At the same time, I'm hearing all that music, I'm into hip hop.
Hmm.
And whether I was hearing the music I listened to or I was hearing their music, I'm starting to hear similarities. I'm like, wait a second, like, that's not a Temptation song, that's on a hip hop record, or that's not a funk or disco song. That's my music. And I start to investigate this idea of sampling. And I'm like, oh, okay, so my music is basically taking from my parents' music and kind of rejiggering, the beats and the rhythms and everything. And what really happened for me with jazz was getting into A Tribe Called Quest, Diggable Planets,
Hmm.
and going through the samples and finding kind of like the soul jazz they were sampling, Ronnie Foster. They even sampled some earlier stuff like Art Blakey, and that sent me down a rabbit hole of investigating this music. I think I would have gotten there eventually, but it just springboarded things. And to your point, I was probably the only one of my friends who was the weirdo in the corner who wanted to play
Right.
jazz. So then, after that introduction, you start to learn, then you go through all the staples, you go through Miles, you go through Coltrane, you go through like the low hanging fruit. And I was just fortunate enough to get a job in a music store where I had great influence from some of the staff there who were older than me. Some of them were jazz majors in college and working at the store. So they'd be like, oh, if you like Miles, try this. If you like Coltrane, try that. And it really catapulted me into this whole other stratosphere. What really tied things together is when I got back into records, it was on the tail end of the analog production, acoustic sounds, prestige reissue series. And
Hmm.
then obviously Blue Note was doing all their stuff. And what I loved about that is that a lot of those records I already knew, but I hadn't been through in a long time. And it really reinvigorated my love for it, picking up a lot of those albums and kind of getting me back into jazz pretty heavily. Now, I don't consider myself an encyclopedia or an aficionado, but it's certainly the genre I listen to the most, probably at home, especially the past couple of years. So it's just this kind of level up every few years of my life with something new about it. And the thing I've found is that I think generally people don't know where to start, and I don't think there's a wrong place to start. And I think people are intimidated by it. I know I was intimidated by jazz and by classical because it seemed like this, maybe elitist genre that you had to be like really cool or really hip to listen to. But once you break down that wall, the possibilities are endless. That's kind of my journey with it. And it's never going to end because even though a lot of the music is frozen in time, and there is a contemporary scene, but obviously it's not as prolific as the past, you can still go back and find plenty of stuff that you didn't know about, which I know we're going to get into tonight, just how everything is all interweaving and related to one another. So I'm excited for a good conversation.
Yeah, yeah, man. I'm excited too. So, I mean, I do like what you said too about like the intimidation factor, which for me, I guess coming into it sort of young and early, like I didn't have that really with jazz, as so much just because I had a resource, in my dad that I could kind of tap into a little bit, who could at least get me started. But yeah, it is definitely, I've talked to a lot of people, even just in the last couple of years since starting my channel and actually being able to have conversations with people around jazz, more people around jazz and stuff, is that a lot of them really do appreciate, just yeah, I don't know, having I don't want to say a safe conversation, but one that's just, a little less intimidating and kind of break into, it's like, it's not a big deal. It's no different than like breaking into Led Zeppelin or Jimi Hendrix or whatever, Talking Heads or something. Sometimes it can seem that way, but yeah, it's really not. So today we really wanted to get into, kick off this series. I think the first handful of episodes are going to be, we thought it'd be fun to kind of go through one instrument a show and just kind of talk about not only the best, I know, calling it like the five greatest saxophone players, but really, touch on a couple that a lot of people are already going to know. But then Chris and I'll really kind of get into some of our favorite stuff and maybe more like hidden gem type stuff, and maybe some stuff that a lot of people maybe haven't really heard of, especially if you're just kind of breaking into jazz. But even if you know a lot about jazz, these might be records that, you might want to refresh your memory on and stuff. So yeah, of course, I mean, dude, we're talking about saxophone. Like it would, the elephant in the room is like, of course, we're going to talk about Coltrane, right? You can't avoid it.
The goat.
The goat. Although, I like to throw some shine on Sonny. I always, whenever I start going back and forth, it's like, Sonny's my guy, just to be a little different. So anyway, yeah. So, there's a couple of records that each of us, artists that both Chris and I picked. So we're going to go through those first. And after that, we're just kind of, if you can round robin with two people, I'm just kind of go back and forth and show some of the other records that we think people should check out. Some really great jazz saxophone stuff. So, all right, we'll kick off with Coltrane. And for me, I had to pick, and I guess you could go a few different ways, right? Even if you went top tier Coltrane, there's still like, at least a handful of different records you could go with. I picked Giant Steps. And this is the mono rhino vinyl, which is actually really sounds great, man. At least my copy sounds really, really good. The Black Atlantic label. And this is one of those where kind of changed a lot in the whole jazz scene, right? This was released in 1960. Coltrane's first album as a leader on Atlantic, which of course he went on and was very prolific with Atlantic after this. A lot of people, there's an Atlantic box set and people seek out just the Atlantic stuff because there's so much great stuff. And this is an album that my girlfriend can listen to. Most importantly, it's funny. I was doing a live stream somewhere and I played a couple jazz albums and I go, "Did you like either of those albums?" And she's like, "I like that second one you were playing." I'm like, "Oh, that was Giant Steps." So that was kind of cool, because it is, even though obviously there's a lot of, I don't want to say challenging music, but there's a lot of challenging playing on this, as we well know, right? But I still think it's very accessible. And I love it. I think, Coltrane's sound is like, it's always lively. It's very technical still, but at the same time, it's always in the pocket, it's always in the groove, and in his unique way. Like, it's Coltrane. So all those things are true, but sheets of sound, yes, level, exactly. The whole circle of thirds or whatever it is. And again, not pretending to be a musician, but, if you know this record, a lot of us have heard that stuff. And challenging too. I guess the piano player, I don't have it in front of me. Who's the guy that played piano on this? Oh, well, expect mistakes today, guys. It was challenging to play along with the chord changes and stuff like that, but I think he does a great job. Anyway, Giant Steps, that's my first one. I think this is a good pressing. We might as well get into a little bit of, some of the records and stuff. This is, for me, I'd read that Giant Steps was tough to find one that had a good mastering. And there's a lot of bad presses of this. And so doing my homework a little bit, I'm looking for that balance of like value and quality without spending $500. And these rhinos came up. And so this is why I picked it up. It's affordable and it sounds really great. So, I can recommend it for someone that's not going to go out and buy an OG or something. I think these, and they're in mono, I think the rhinos are really good. So next one, I just have one more, and this is Coltrane's Sound. And this is one that, wasn't really on my radar for a long time, even with all the Coltrane I had. This is one that was kind of new to me in terms of really identifying the music with this record. Again, this is one that was, whereas Giant Steps came out, I think it was recorded in 59, came out in 60. This was recorded in 60, so it's right there with it in terms of era. And turns out, I think Chris already knows this, but this came out of the material that was not used for My Favorite Things. So it's the same sessions, it's the same lineup. You get McCoy Tyner and Elvin Jones on here. And Yeah, I think so too, Level. I mean, this is a very underrated record, and there's some great stuff on here, man. I was just listening to it before the show. Um, I think tracks that I really like are going to be 26-2 is one that's on here. And what was the other one? Central Park West, I think. Now I'm having a hard. Oh, Liberia. Track 3, side 1. Liberia. 6 minutes 45 seconds. Great track. Um, so yeah, love this record. Again, like Level says, this is kind of a hidden gem, kind of underrated. And again, it comes out of the My Favorite Things sessions. So if you like My Favorite Things, this might be a great one to pick up. So yeah, that's my Coltrane.
Well
What do
done,
you got,
man.
Chris?
Well, I'm glad you brought up My Favorite Things because I'm looking for accessibility to someone who wants a place to start. And for me,
Yeah.
this was my first Coltrane album. I had gotten a CD
Ooh.
reissue that came out, and I fell in love with it. But what made me fall in love with this record is that it's very familiar. He's covering a lot of Rodgers and Hammerstein on this album, most notably My Favorite Things. You get Summertime on it. And anybody in America as a kid hears those melodies, in movies, commercials. My wife always jokes that, "Oh, is that the Christmas album?" When she hears My Favorite Things, and I go, "It's not a Christmas song. It's not a Christmas song." But I think that this is a really good entry point for people. As you stated, there is a ton of entry points for Coltrane. You can't go wrong with probably 6 to 8 different albums as your first listen, but I just feel like this is very familiar to people, given the track choices on here. And what's amazing to me, again, a non-musician, but just a music fan on My Favorite Things, is his ability to have that locomotive playing, that freight train playing,
Mm.
keep the melody jam and wrap around all these different changes and always get back to the core of what he's playing. And I think that's a fantastic ride. And every time I put this stuff on, even though I've heard it for so long, for so many years, I always find something new about it. As far as pressing goes, those that are getting to know me know that I'm a big Analog Productions fan. So this is the A75 release. Double 45, which can be a nuisance for a lot of people. I also think there's great value in the 60th anniversary that came out, which is very comprehensive, stereo and mono. Um, a ton of great pressings that you can find that are affordable. And you know what? If you don't have to get it on vinyl, even though it's a vinyl show, you should go stream this. Go sample it. Go listen to it because this could be a really big gateway into a world of joy when you get into John Coltrane. And the thing I also love about Coltrane.
Well, can I ask you a quick question about because
Sure.
you made me think of something because yeah, it's a lot of familiar music and stuff. My Favorite Things, especially when
Yeah.
I first heard that record, and we're probably going back over 20 years. I'm just gonna be honest, like it almost kind of turned me off because I kind of heard that first song and I was like, oh man, this reminds me of that movie and I really had to kind of get into it. Did you sort of have a similar thing, or did you just vibe with it immediately?
It's a really good question. I didn't have that kind of connotation. I've had that with music before outside
Mm,
of jazz. There's a ton of examples of that. But to me, I was like, I think you took something really cheesy, in my opinion, and totally flipped it on its head and blew
there
my
you go.
mind with it. You know what I mean? So like, I get it though. I've like I said, I've had reactions to that to similar situations where people are taking popular music, and I'm like, oh, that's corny. But this is why I scooped this because when I heard that, I was like, all right, that's something that's interesting. And in my opinion, and I'm going to say this about another classic of Coltrane, it's the definitive version in my mind. Like, there's nothing better than Coltrane. My Favorite Things. There's nobody that does it better. I don't care, who did it first or who did it after.
Yeah,
Train's the pedestal.
that's a great
Um,
point.
and what I love about Coltrane too, in general, is that in my humble opinion, outside of Dylan and maybe Miles, I think he's the most important musician in American history. Outside of those two, I just think that what he did was so groundbreaking. And I feel that I've heard a lot of non-jazz musicians talk about how important he was, whether it's Carlos Santana, whether it's guys in the Grateful Dead, the drummer from the Doors. I've heard so many sound bites of guys being just so influenced by his approach to music, that I just think Coltrane's essential, and I guess that's why we're doing him first, right?
Yep.
Um, but the other thing about, jazz in general for me, and especially with Coltrane, is that he brought me on to so many other great artists. And I'm not going to say that he brought me to Miles. I don't think that's fair to say. But my favorite Coltrane with Miles record, outside of the obvious Kind of Blue, is Milestones.
Mm.
And this is another great record, really full of some pseudo standards. Coltrane's playing is off the wall on this. He's accompanied by Cannibal Adderley, another great player. Great lineup here with Philly Joe Jones and Paul Chambers. And outside of Kind of Blue, this was my first favorite Miles record. I had this right after I had My Favorite Things. And the one thing that this taught me was got to read the liner notes, because you never know who's connected to who, especially in the world of jazz. So this one just holds a special place in my heart. And then another great album, which I don't really know if there's a leader on this album, but it's certainly a strong collaboration. This was actually recommended to me by a coworker maybe about 10 years ago, and they just released an OJC of it a few months ago, but The Cats. So this
Ooh.
is John Coltrane, Tommy Flanagan, Kenny Burrell. And if it wasn't for this album being introduced to it several years ago, I would have never investigated Tommy Flanagan as a piano player. And that
Mm.
is so important to note, because these guys, superstars in their own right individually, they all played together and supported one another. So this is just really a fantastic listen. And when you really hear this record, how smooth and cool it is, there isn't a better name for it than The Cats. I mean, this is
Yep.
legitimately like, really sweet playthrough. So that is my Coltrane excursion on vinyl. Now, I was in high school, I think, when this came out, and this really blew my mind. And this also features some other great players, namely, I know someone's very close to your heart, Jason, Eric Dolphy. But
Never heard of them.
this box set is not on vinyl as far as I know, or at least in its entirety, and it is available to stream. But this is Coltrane at the Village Vanguard in 1961. And when you talk about standards having the definitive version, if I could recommend one track for anybody to listen to that has never listened to John Coltrane, you need to pull up this album, or you can get on Africa Brass, but you need to listen to his version of Green Sleeves. It will
Mm.
absolutely send chills up your spine. Another one of these standards that Coltrane just mastered. And to me, I know it's maybe blasphemous, but it might be his definitive track in his catalog. I just love the way he plays on that. And I go back to it all the time when I need to pick me up, throw that on the headphones, throw that on the table. And Coltrane's Green Sleeves from the 61 live shows is just completely awesome. So that's
Well,
my spiel on the GOAT.
I love that he has the relationship with Dolphy that maybe a lot of people, if you're just kind of into popular jazz and the records that, most of the records that are easily available out there, you could forget that there was a time when Dolphy loved playing with everybody. He could do different things with different artists and stuff, but Coltrane was one he really loved. But it's been difficult to get some of that music, and so like the one that you just showed, and then also I'll just show this is Evenings at the Village Gate, which came out last year, I guess. Is this a Record Store Day? I can't remember, but
I'm not sure, but it came out a
I
couple of
can't
years
remember.
ago.
Yeah, it's a great one, man, and it's a kind of a peek into that. Now a lot of the stuff's live and not always well recorded and stuff, their work together, but it's still a snapshot into an extremely important time and an extremely important duo that really influenced each other. And so, and this one's on Impulse. So yeah, just another one. I'm glad you brought that up, man, because, well, any reason to bring up Dolphy.
Well,
But
Jason, you bring up a really good point on something that I think people really need to care about. And you and I have really been talking a lot about music and records overall, but in this audiophile world, which I really appreciate, I think people forget the importance of the music. And I think when you listen to that live at the Village Gate, or you listen to the Vanguard 61 recordings, and you get this on their studio stuff too, you have to appreciate the chances that these guys were taking.
Mm.
And you have to appreciate that they were willing to gamble on especially in the live environment, um, coming through and taking chances on the songs they were playing, stretching the boundaries, pushing each other, not playing the same song the same way 2 times in a row, even in an afternoon set and a night set. And I think that for me, I know you're a Grateful Dead fan. I'm a Grateful Dead fan. I'm a massive,
How'd I
massive.
know you were going to channel the dead right
You know, I'm
there?
going to try to channel Fish too. I think that the introduction of this music and understanding the chances these guys took in the studio and out of the studio has actually influenced everything else I listen to, because I
Mm,
hear jazz in almost everything I love. You know what I mean? So
yep.
people get hung up on audio quality. Listen, I know that's important. I'm like that too, but you shouldn't just dismiss a recording like that just because it might not be the finest of sound quality. It's still worth investigating and experiencing. And that's really one of the messages I want people to take away from these talks is it is ultimately about the music, whether it's all analog, cut by Kevin Gray, or it's streaming on your Spotify. You should really investigate a lot of this stuff.
Yeah. I agree. Yep. No, I've said it before. It's like, you can't swear off a lot of this stuff, especially the early guys like Dizzy and Charlie Parker and stuff like that. It's the only way we really have to hear their early stuff. And so, yeah, it's not going to sound like, it's going to sound like there's somebody with the Flintstones where like the bird's beak was the needle and you had to crank it. So it's
Yeah,
going to sound a little
absolutely.
bit like that, but it's like, it's still so great. And I'll even go so far as to say some of the greatest stuff came out during that time, the early bebop era, that the torch was being carried by guys like Charlie and Bud Powell and Dizzy and all those guys. Yeah, it would be great if we had more high fidelity audio of that, but we don't. So we just got to appreciate what we have.
Yep.
All right. Ooh, boy, time is getting away from us. All right, let's go. We'll go Sonny. You want to jump in on Sonny? Sonny
No,
Rollins.
you start with Sunny.
All right, I'm gonna go quick because I know we're running out of time. We want to get to some, not running out of time, but we're trying to do an hour and we're already a half hour in. This is a great one, and I know great minds think alike. Chris picked this one too. So this is Sonny Rollins, another great saxophone player, one of the greats. Right there with Coltrane, and really has his own style. I love Sonny's technique. For me, that's what I really get into, his technique for some reason. He can play forever and never play the same note the same way twice. You can hear a long track from him. He can go on for 10, 15 minutes, and it just feels like everything from timbre to volume to just whatever. Again, I'm not a saxophone player, but you'll know it when you hear it. He puts 100% into every note, and everyone's a little different. And it's always surprising. It never goes right where you think it's going to go, but it's always perfect too. And that's what I love about Sonny. It's why I put him right there with Coltrane. This one's fantastic because you get Thelonious Monk. Just quickly, this has a song on here called Friday the 13th. If you listen to nothing else I say today, go listen to that song. It's just so great. I just love it. So, and it's the combination of Thelonious and Sonny on this record, Monk and Sonny on this record, is just so exquisite. When I just want to sit down and vibe out and just appreciate great music and a great vibe and a fantastic. The thing about Monk, and we're not into piano players yet, but he was one of the great jazz composers. And so when people like Coltrane and Sonny come along for the ride, it's just such a great palette for them to do their work on. So boom, that's what I'm saying right there about Thelonious Monk and Sonny Rollins. Check out Friday the 13th. This is the OJC, very affordable. That's my Sonny take.
Is that what you got? You got more? Or no?
That's what I got. I just got one. Yeah.
All right. So I'll go quick on Sunny because I know we have a lot to get into. One of the things, and this is just a personal preference of mine. Jason and I have talked about this. One of the things I love about jazz artists is when they hit the big three. And my big three is Prestige, Balluno, Impulse. I don't know, can't really put my finger on it, but there's something about the aura of those records and those labels that kind of define careers. And I feel like a lot of these guys have definitive records that have played on all three at each one of those labels. But for me, my intro to Sonny, Saxophone Colossus, just an absolute scorcher of a record. This is the Analog Productions Prestige reissue. So
Which,
glad.
by the way, that series, they just did it right.
It's a crime against humanity that these took so long to go back and print. They're so affordable for the quality they are, and oftentimes you get into these audiophile discussions about great sounding records, but to have great sounding records that are essential and to put them out in this packaging and capacity is just the gift that keeps on giving. And I would say that I think the vinyl community, and especially some of these reissue labels, are doing a phenomenal job in keeping this art form alive, because it's bringing people who are just concerned about sound quality, or maybe they like that reissue label, to expose them to this stuff is absolutely fantastic. This is a record where if I put it on, it doesn't get one spin, it gets two or three. And I have a lot of records to listen to. So for me to do that and dedicate that much time means a lot. So I love this Sonny Rollins record. And then another one I love is, and there's many versions of this. I have a standard version, but this is the Way Out West Sonny Rollins record. And to me, this is just a movie soundtrack in my head. This is just a concept album of all concept albums. I feel the tumbleweed going by with some funk and soul put through it. It's just a great atmospheric album, in my opinion. Even the percussion playing and the way you really get wrapped up in that Western or spaghetti Western sound and feel is just phenomenal. I think that this is an okay starting point for Sonny. I think it's a fun record. I think it's really well done. And if you're an audiophile, it's really well recorded. You're going to see so many different issues of this come out in different formats because it's in high demand. And again, Sonny right there with Coltrane as far as influence and impact. I think those are my Sonny picks for the night. And the Monk, which you went over as well.
Very, very nice. Yeah. And of course, guys, we could get so deep on these, but the whole idea is just kind of, pick some that are just kind of special, to share and stuff. All right. So I'm going to take it back. I'm going to take it way, way back on this one. And I do want to show this guy some love. Obviously, this is one of the guys that sort of pioneered modern saxophone, pioneered the whole bebop era, the whole hard bop era, and everything that came after. And I'm talking about Charlie Parker. And this one is a record store day. But again, going back to what you said about, having recordings that aren't, these aren't going to be audiophile recordings, right? Even these is, you can only clean them up so much. But this is actually a really great entry point. It's got a long title. This one's called The Long Lost Bird Live Afro Q Bop Recordings. And you even get some Dizzy on here. And, I really credit Dizzy. Charlie Parker, I think a lot of people, you say bebop, this is the guy that pops in their head, Charlie Parker, and rightly so. But I credit Dizzy for really carrying the torch and even getting Charlie Parker to the gigs and stuff like that. Like, we all know Charlie had some, unfortunately had some challenges. And I feel like Dizzy was the guy kind of like, always championing Charlie, always coming up with gigs for them to do, always in the studio and stuff and making sure he got recorded. We're not talking about trumpets today, but part of the reason I think we remember Charlie and why he became so great is Dizzy kept him going as long as he could. And just fantastic. So this is a great one. Double LP. I know what I was going to say too. Part of the reason I picked Charlie is because some of these guys are real easy, I think, to get into. And you start, you want to start putting together some Coltrane. It's pretty easy. My favorite things, Giant Steps, we talked about them. There's, a handful of big ones. He's very collectible. It's easy to go through the catalog and see which ones you want and kind of branch out. Same thing with Sonny. But with some of these older ones, because they were all recorded on 78 RPM, and they all got a ton of different kinds of reissues and it can be difficult to kind of know where to start sometimes. Where should I jump in? How do I find, it's daunting in the sense that you want to get a good record, but there's, I don't know, it's just, there's not a lot of, it's not collectible in the same way. And
Mm.
so that's why I'm showing the records that I'm showing you, is because I think this is an easy one to just pick up and vibe to. Like I said, it's got Dizzy on here, some of the great classic Charlie Parker's on there. And then another one that I think is easy to just pick up and kind of, I say collect, but just kind of add to the collection and listen to and know you're going to get good stuff, is the stuff that he did for Dial. And a lot of the stuff came out originally on 10-inch, and there's multiple volumes of these. I don't remember how many, maybe 4 volumes or so. Well, then they recently did these, and these are the best of the Dial Masters, Volume 1 and Volume 2. Another great way, affordable way to kind of jump in on Charlie Parker and know you're going to get some good stuff, and it's going to be curated, and it's not going to be I don't know, just some of the stuff that can be difficult. So yeah, if you're someone that thinks about, you pass up the Charlie Parker section and you're sort of like, man, I kind of want to get some of that, about where the hell do I start? This gives you a little bit of order to your life when you're kind of thinking about Charlie. Other people will have others. There's been some box sets that have come out that are really great for the various labels he recorded for and stuff. But for me, I think I decided to snag these, and I think that's a really great place to start. So we got Volume 1 and 2 of the Dial Masters, the Record Store Day, the Long Lost Bird live sessions, all fantastic. He's, we need to talk about Bird because he's the guy that pioneered a lot of this, and have we even caught up to him in a lot of ways? I mean, and so, but like I said, it's difficult. Sometimes, we know he's there, we know he's important, but we don't know how to access him necessarily. At least that's how I kind of felt early on. So anyway, I'll shut up now.
No, so Jason, this is my struggle with this, and I think you're really nailing it. And I have experience working in a music store for a while, kind of seeing this. I don't know what you should get, right? Like when you see, because there's all these kind of like knockoff labels that are putting stuff out, and everything was scattered. There wasn't necessarily albums he was putting out. There were the 10 inches and things like that. So they've done a good compilation, and I think that's been something that is important for people to hear, because you're going to have to go with kind of like a retrospective of his career as an entry point, or a live album, because I think it's the easiest way. The other thing that concerns me, and I think you're kind of seeing this a little bit with pop music too, or rock and roll with like Elvis, maybe like Chuck Berry, Jerry Lee Lewis, things like that, Little Richard. There's only so much that people will remember of the past. And I feel like some of these guys, like, my parents still very young, like I still grew up on Elvis, and I was still exposed to Elvis and that music, or, things of that period. And I fear that because Parker is so old now, right? You're going on 90 years ago, these recordings happened, and they're not accessible, or you don't think they're accessible, that he's going to get forgotten. And I love the statement you just made. In a lot of ways, we caught up to him, and it's true. It's true. And he died young, as Eddie, pointed out in the chat. It's important that you're kind of highlighting this, and you just gave me some good inspiration, because I do remember seeing just some very basic CD box sets that you could pick up on him, but to see what you can get on vinyl, on the Dial stuff, that's something I'm going to investigate. It's a good tip.
Yeah, I think it's a kind of a fun way to get it. I think a lot of times, when we're putting together collections, we want to have the finest records, and stuff. And so you see these, like you said, a lot of these bootleggy, who knows what's on them, how is the quality. I'm glad they reissued these Dial, and especially doing like the best of, because a lot of them are kind of repetitious anyway. So it kind of curates out the best of the Dial Masters, and it's a fun way. They look good, so it looks good on the shelf too. But
Heck yeah,
good way to have them.
Good stuff. Well, I want to talk about somebody that arguably could have been the GOAT too. And when you look at this guy's career, another musician that really reinvented himself in so many ways, and we don't even have time to talk about the reinvention and how he's kind of expanded over the decades. But the player I'm going to talk about, I found out not listening to jazz. I found out listening to some good old rock and roll. And this is Steely Dan Asia. And I know there's a lot of people in the comments now that I know that love this record. I'm looking at you, Danny. The sax solo on Asia blew my mind. I'm a huge Steely Dan fan. When I was a kid, I was listening to this, and I go, who is playing the sax on this record, and lo and behold, it's Wayne Shorter. So that sent me into a tailspin of trying to understand, who is this guy? What is he? Where is he from? And I'm just thinking he's a studio musician. After some research, I find out that obviously one of the greatest jazz players ever. Now, this is somebody, in my opinion, who's essential in so many ways. And I'm going to start off with my favorite Wayne Shorter album as a leader, with my favorite Wayne Shorter tune being on this album, and another album I'm going to mention, but a great intro to Wayne, in my opinion, is Adam's Apple. And this is the Blue Note Classic reissue, which came out, I think, a couple of years ago at this point. And if I could recommend one track to people who just want a quick hit, you got to go with Footprints on here, which I think is the first track on side B, if I'm not mistaken. Yeah, first track on side B. Which is a killer tune, jazz classic, in my opinion. And the thing I love about Wayne Shorter, outside of like just the general approach and the transitions he made over his career, is that here's another guy who can make a quartet or a quintet just sound like a monster is in the room, and do it with such precision and such class that I think he's probably one of the top 2 or 3 jazz composers all the time. You talk about Monk. I think Wayne Shorter is right there with him as far as being a composer, and also kind of laying that landscape for others to kind of fill in around him. Two projects he worked on. These might be kind of obvious for those in the audience, but my 2 of my favorite Miles records. You're looking at Miles Smiles, and you're looking at Miles in the Sky. And both of these do not get off the ground to become as essential as they are without Wayne Shorter being involved with this period of Miles's career. And what I really think happens to Wayne after kind of leaving the Miles era that he was in is he goes off and really embraces the fusion scene. And I'm not going to show any Weather Report records, but this guy goes from starting off with the Jazz Messengers, going through his Blue Note solo career as a leader, supporting Miles and some of the finest work that Miles has done. And then he just completely takes a left turn and goes into Weather Report and blows people's minds from the 70s through the 80s. And, the Weather Report era is fantastic and, should be listened to. And that's a great band just in general. Then Wayne does something equally impressive, in my opinion, is he links up with Joni Mitchell for a few records and really becomes involved with some of her projects. And I'm not going to show any Joni records tonight, but there is this great Herbie record that came out. This might have won Grammy for an album of the year Grammy, or was at least nominated. And, no matter how you feel about the Grammys, this definitely probably deserved it at that time. But this is a record by Herbie that Wayne is all over, which is mostly Joni tunes. And his interpretation of Joni tunes is absolutely mind blowing. And there's some standards on here as well, but
dude, I have to check that out.
You
had me at Herbie, first of all, but
of course. And the thing about this, and I love when musicians do this, is that Wayne was a monster in his own period, but he's a monster afterwards, and he's a monster on other people's music. And I think that's the separation to me of like the greats in this genre versus just the standard, great but tier 2 players, let's say. And when you hear this record, it's just completely mind-blowing. I also found out in kind of preparing for the show, and I never knew this, but he also played the solo on Don Henley's End of the Innocents, which I wasn't aware of.
Oh, really?
Yeah, I did not know that. So when there's crossover and these guys are monsters on crossover music, I think that's a really important aspect of their career, especially later on.
Well, you're making me think too, and you and I kind of touched on this privately, which is just, these artists that are able to kind of go from one generation to the next and kind of change the music scene. And a lot of times we think about it, and you kind of made me think about this, is the person changing with the time, like taking it from the 50s and the 60s, and like Miles changed his thing with all the fusion and stuff. And, there's a whole bunch of names we could mention about people that Herbie's another big one, doing Rocket, in the 80s and stuff like
Crazy.
that. But the truth is, I think, and the way I've kind of thought about this is they're not following the times, they're inventing the times. I mean, these are the best of the best. These guys are taking what they're hearing or what's going on in the zeitgeist in the world or in music or whatever, and creating something totally new. And I think in hindsight, it can seem like, oh, this was Herbie's blah, blah, blah record, or something. And sometimes it can feel like that, like when the Stones do disco or something. But I mean, in some ways and in some cases, like they're creating that, like they're making that happen by continuing to be innovative and stuff. Somebody has to invent that stuff, right? So anyway, I think that's a topic for another show, but that's what that kind of reminds me of too with Shorter.
Well, one thing I just want to say, I agree with everything you're saying, and it's a fantastic point. But I also think that those pivotal moments of inventing the times, especially the way the jazz community is constructed from like an artist perspective, is that it elicits a response.
Right.
So you have to, if you go back to, especially like I guess probably in the 80s or so, there was that whole reverting back to classical jazz. Like when the Marsalis brothers started to make records and stuff, it's like they were responding to that fusion. So it's like, even though you might not like what those artists did and create that time, there is effect of response to branch off that. Not even that they're influenced by it in a style way, but it's a response to what they believe shouldn't have happened. And there's fruit in that as well. So, these guys, again, going back to taking the chances, we were talking about Coltrane and Dolphy on stage. Like if they don't take those chances, you don't get any residual impact from those chances being taken with that artist or the artists around them. So it is an important thing to see people grow. You might not like it, but it's a necessary growth for them to be relevant over time. And I don't know about you, but I go back to some jazz records when I first heard when I was like getting into jazz and I hated it. Now I know more of their catalog. I'm like, oh, I get where this goes now. I understand where this is coming from, and it makes more sense to me, and I like it more than I had in the past. So I think you're bringing up a good point about just the creation of the transition, I guess, for the genre.
Yeah, that's a great point. All right, so let me go to any excuse to kind of in a roundabout way touch on some other instrumentalists that aren't saxophone players, but some of these guys, like you said, some of these guys I discovered through other musicians, and this saxophone player is one of them, and it's Harold Land. And I would not know about Harold Land without Bobby Hutcherson. And so this right here, San Francisco, is one that kind of really brought my attention to Land's playing. It's just, first of all, this is just a fantastic album. It's got Bobby Hutcherson compositions. I have everything by Hutcherson. I love when I love when he's composing the music because I just love his composition so much. I almost feel a little cheated when it's like, he lets some other people do some of the writing. But Harold Land on this, he's so complimentary to what Bobby's doing. His playing's very sparse. He plays some oboe on here, which sounds fantastic. I listened to this today. And there's a song on here, which I think I wrote it down, what's on side 2, track 2, side 2. It's called Procession. And if you can listen to that and not be moved, not have something physical happen to your body, I don't know what's wrong with you. I put it on as soon as the piano starts. I'm already starting to tear up. It's just so, so good. Harold Land comes in a little late, but he adds exactly what he needs to add to it. That's kind of the story with Harold Land on this record, which makes it kind of interesting. It's a lot of unique, different kind of playing, avant-garde in not a hard bop way, a very much kind of restrained way. And Harold really lends himself to what Bobby's doing. In a way, Bobby sort of sets the scene early and says, this is where we're going. And then Land's like, all right, I got it. And comes in and just nails it. San Francisco. This came out as a classic series, so really easy to snag these now. And Harold Land's just someone I felt like I had to mention kind of for that reason. He's someone that, maybe the average person maybe hasn't heard of, but it's great kind of discovering these guys through other musicians. And so now it's like, I'll listen to anything with Harold Land on. I'll give it a chance just because of how good he is right here with Bobby. So fantastic album. Listen for Harold on here. It's impeccable. It's so different from like, say, a Coltrane or Dolphy or Sunny, where it's very restrained, it's very refined, it's very just, but you realize how just hard that is, and how he's lending to the harmonics and everything. Anyway, I'm not a musician, but I know enough listening to this stuff. It's very, very good. So Harold Land is sorry guys, darn it. Harold Land is another one of my guys. Yeah, and so I just got one. I know we're kind of short on time, so I want to make sure we can keep grooving. Let me just get for the people watching the video. Sorry about that. Oh.
When I think of Howard Land, I feel there's a great Nas lyric that sums him up. He's never on schedule, but always on time. When he comes in, I know exactly what track you're talking about. He just comes in at the right point, and there's, I think a lot of the players we've been talking about tonight are freight trains, right? And I think there's a lot of beauty in that restriction, and there's a lot of precision that goes on, and knowing that you have to pull back on a lot of these tracks or a lot of these situations that they're in. And there is a wealth of active listening you can do, identifying that that's happening, and that's when you start to appreciate how good some of these players are. So I think your description of Harold Land from that, I know that record very well. I think I even tried to give you a copy because I have a couple of them.
Oh, that's right.
But that's a really key track. I'm glad you pointed it out.
Yeah. And I love that you pick up on that, because it's not always about filling the air with notes, right? It's not always like where you feel like Charlie Parker can feel, he's the master. You can't even keep up. So much is happening. And it's how the thing is constructed, and maybe what 5 notes do and where it lands, and then this note's here. But with Harold Land, it's very much about slowing things down, and just, it's a whole different ball game, right? A whole different technique. It's holding notes. It's raising an amplitude, and it brings a whole nother level of appreciation to saxophone playing. So anyway, I want you to go to go in with your next one. I'm sorry, now I'm flustered because of the video getting wacky, but yeah, we're already pushing almost an hour. I don't mind going a little bit over. It's cool, but yeah, let's. We'll keep
I don't mind going over either. I think there's some great comments too from some really, really insightful people too we can address as well. But I always have, I don't want to say a problem, and I don't know what the reason is that this player doesn't get talked about enough, but this is just like your description of Harold Land just being perfect to me all the time. And I find that every record or song or feature or side project that this artist plays on, I can't get enough of. And I'm talking about Joe Henderson, which in my opinion is arguably the most underrated saxophone player in jazz. And I know a lot of like really hardcore jazz heads will be like, Chris, you're stating the obvious, but this is just not somebody that comes up on a list all the time that people should, as artists that people should investigate. I love Page One. This is also, we're going to be a lot, I'm a big reissue guy. I'm not going out and seeking OGs on this stuff, and I'm not seeking out, G plus copies just to say I have an original that sound terrible. I love that these series are in print. It's essential. This is a great record. Kenny Dorham is on this as well with him, and McCoy Tyner's on piano. I mean, that's just some of the backbone of these records. Joe is a classy, smooth player, especially in this era in the Blue Note time in his career, where he is just absolutely able, kind of like Land, and he plays more notes than Land, I guess. He's a little bit more active in a lot of cases, but he is just right in the pocket of some of the most talented musicians the jazz world has seen on a lot of these records. I love this record. And front to back, I mean, I love Lamesha on here. It's got a little bit of a Latin flavor at times. And that's the other thing about Joe, is that if you really follow his career, he'll play I guess hard bop. He'll play Latin Afro-Cuban stuff. He'll go avant-garde on you. He'll go fusion. He'll go straight up R&B and soul on some of his records. And you just know from his tone that it's Joe every time. This is just a fantastic record for somebody to investigate. The obvious side, Joe Henderson as a side musician is, I don't know, maybe top 5, top 10 jazz records of all time. That's Lee Morgan's The Sidewinder.
Mm.
Joe's playing on this is just exquisite, from front to back. He's part of a great band, obviously. Billy Higgins, also one of my favorites, is on here. But when you start to investigate the world of jazz, you're going to come across um, Lee Morgan Sidewinder, and this is where I encourage everybody: when you find a jazz record that you like, and Jason spoke about this, get involved with who the band is, because that's going to be your next gateway into the next great artist. And then one that doesn't get spoken about a lot, and I don't know if this record is hard to get. I don't see it reissued a lot. I don't see, when I've gone out and looked for, in the stores, I don't find it a lot. I know you can stream it. I know there's definitely been CD reissues, but this is a record from the late 70s. And Jason,
Hmm.
knowing what you like, you really got to investigate
Ooh.
this album.
I started looking at those names, dude. I was like,
It-
okay, you have my attention.
so this is killer. This has got Joe Henderson on it, Ron Carter on bass, who basically played with everybody except Coltrane, Billy Higgins, and Chick Corea, right?
Billy Higgins,
Chick
who
Corea.
again played with everybody.
Exactly.
But you got Chick
So
Corea on there, yeah.
when I listen to jazz or I get into jazz, it's very rare that I go this far into the into the 1970s or 80s. Just not always my favorite stuff. You could not tell when this album was recorded. It's got so many feels and eras on it. Sounds like it could have been done in 1961 in the heart of New York City. Also sounds like it could have been done in 1978 or 79 when they did it. But the playing is superb. And I think this is one of these records, and I think this is reflected a little bit in the Pablo series that's been getting reissued, where these are guys that are seasoned veterans that are just coming out. They know what they can play. They know what their places are. They're not overplaying. They're not underplaying. They're just filling in where they need to be. And it's just a beautiful record overall. So even if you can't get this on vinyl, this is worth the CD scoop. This is worth the stream. Be interested to hear people start listening to this, what they think about it. Because this is just, there's a lot of great jazz records. This is probably my top 10 or top 15 ever. I
I
absolutely
need to check that
love
out.
this
I
album.
love what you said too, because if you are going to go that late into jazz, those are the guys to do it with. I mean, Chick Corea, Ron Carter, Herbie Hancock, they're just always top notch. I got to just shout out Dave right here. Chick Corea is good. Ron Carter is good. It's like, dude, understatement of the century.
Yeah.
I love you, Dave. That's a great one, dude. I have not seen that. I have to check that out.
Yeah, it's really great.
I can't wait till we get into piano because
Wow.
we're gonna have to talk about Herbie a lot more. So yeah, I just got one more here, and this one again, Gateway came from Bobby Hutcherson on this one, and I do have 4 records here, but I'm just gonna go through them quick. I'll talk a little bit about one of them. But there's a nice little trilogy of records that Jackie McLean put out that Bobby plays on, Bobby Hutcherson,
Mhm.
and they sound so great together. This one is Action, 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 got the Tone Poet this year. Bobby Hutcherson and Jackie McLean have been getting the love from Blue Note over the last couple
100%.
years. Really appreciate that. The next one, again, it's Bobby's on this one too. Destination, Destination Out. These are all going to be Blue Notes. Another fantastic one right there. And then the one I want to throw a little love to is One Step Beyond right there. Jackie McLean again. And again, was exposed to Jackie through Bobby. And I just think, and I've said this many times, there's pairs of musicians that just are so much greater. The whole is so much greater than the parts. For me, it would be like, Eddie Van Halen and, David Lee Roth. It's like, there's something about that match, it's like, I'm going to blank out, but you just put your 2 favorite musicians that play together and they're like that, Bobby Hutcherson and Jackie McLean really are. You cannot go wrong. I think picking up one of these 3 or all of them, Jackie McLean as a leader on these. I think this is the first one where Jackie kind of replaced the piano player with vibraphonist Bobby Hutcherson. And we've heard that before with like Out to Lunch and even the few records preceding that, where certain horn players will feel like the vibraphone really brings out a whole different thing than a piano. And if you think about it, really, that's kind of the thing, right? It's like matching the piano player with the horn, or matching the vibes with the horn. And in this case, perfect decision. It's Bobby, obviously, but there is something special about Jackie and Bobby playing together. There are certain parts on this record that will almost feel like one musician.
Mm.
It's two instruments, it's a vibraphone and a sax, but they're so in sync, and the vibes just, I will add, it adds so much to what's coming out of the horn. It's hard to explain. You have to hear it. I'm doing a terrible job of explaining it. But there's just something about how McLean and Hutcherson playing together, to me, sound almost like one person. They're just so in sync.
Jason,
yeah.
Sorry, I'm sorry to jump in.
No.
I love those three records, and I feel like I never really thought about it till you brought it up, but thinking about kind of playing them in my head a bit. Hutcherson and McLean kind of create a pocket together. I feel like it's like, when you get a rock drummer in a good groove that they're there, but they're not dominant. It's like there's something that melds them together, and I think that the piano can be abrasive sometimes when you're trying to create that pocket. The way Bobby's so smooth, right? I mean, that. I mean, the way they just kind of come together. It's just that we talk about that foundation or that template for everybody to play around. They just do such a good job together. I think those three records are severely underrated. I just wanted to throw that in.
Absolutely. No, they elevate each other, and it's different. And when you hear enough of this stuff, it's different than like the relationship between Bobby Hutcherson and Harold Land is just a different relationship. The relationship between Jackie McLean and Bobby is a whole different one. And what it is this like symbiotic relationship that you can't strip one from the other. The track I pick off here would be Ghost Town. I would say check that out. It's so freaking fun. It's adventurous, groovy, it's unusual, it's super cool, and it has a lot of that character that I'm talking about. Jackie McLean is a fantastic saxophone player. He goes way back. He was playing with Miles on Prestige on Dig with Sonny Rollins.
Right.
And Jackie was kind of hidden in there, but was in the early days, but that's kind of where his roots are. He's someone that really had to come into his own, and even with stuff I've read to kind of like confirm, with what his trajectory was, is that on the record Dig specifically, the person that puts that together, and we talked to Miles, we want to do this record, we want to do an LP, we're getting away from the 78s and all this stuff, let's do Dig. And Miles said, what about Jackie? And the guy said, Jackie? But he plays on it, and he pulls it off, and he just continued to develop. So now we're talking about much later, and he just slays on this. And I would say if you see Bobby Hutcherson and Jackie McLean on the same bill, don't hesitate. Even if it's streaming it, CD, whatever it is, I mean, it's just fantastic.
What I love about what you curated for tonight's show is that if you look at the list we put together, there are probably another 15 players that easily could have been discussed. But what I love about what you put together is it's very detailed on why you chose those artists and those albums specifically, like the Jackie Bobby relationship, Monk with Sonny. Obviously we all have different entry points into Coltrane, and I think that's the most important thing about what you're discussing, right? Is that we all can go on like rollingstone.com and get these are the 10 best jazz albums ever, and everybody can start there, but you don't have to start there. You can start with these alternative recommendations, and eventually you're going to get back to the greats. But some of this is so accessible and so easy to get into that the list was curated with a purpose from your journey, right? And I think that's the most important part about these discussions. It's not.
Yeah, it's kind of the whole, like you said, the purpose of even doing this is, we could have just gave you the Wikipedia version or the top 10 Rolling Stone or whatever. I think these picks are just as good. And I think, for people that have already done those lists, I'm a list guy. So believe me, I'm going down, okay, I got to make sure I have these top 10. This is going to be diving a little deeper. So, and I think the whole series will be that way. But yeah, so you got to have at least one more guy to go though, right? You got one more saxophone player to.
I got one more, and I think we've touched on him so much. And admittedly, this was somebody that took me a long time to embrace, but once I got it, it was on like Donkey Kong. And this is really, a lot. Some of this is due to you. I mean, I was getting into him when I was watching your videos, and you kind of tipped me over the top. I mean, I've obviously had a few of his records, but we talked about him, and man, that
Ooh.
stands as one of the geniuses in music history, Eric Dolphy.
We just
And
couldn't avoid bringing him up, guys. I
it's
wanted to give him his own video, and he will get one. But how do you not
yeah,
mention Dolphy? You
and
did
it's
the right thing,
hard.
Chris.
It's hard. It's hard not to mention him. And it this is one of the artists that, and there's a few artists across all genres of music that I treat this way. I don't. I'm choosing an album here, and I have another one to show, but I just celebrate his entire catalog as one because it's so dynamic and it's so unique and so brilliant that I just like to rope a few of his albums together in a session because it just all kind of makes sense back to back for me. I just chose Out There um, just because he just tries a few different things here. I'm not much of a musician. Obviously, he plays alto, but he also plays flute and bass clarinets on here, and it gets this really interesting sound that just appeals to me. I just love the sound of this record. And then the other one, and this is, I feel bad showing this because it's not an expensive record, but it's not something that's accessible. And I'm pretty sure you can't stream this, but this collection here, Eric Dolphy, Musical Prophet, which really highlights his New York sessions in what, Jason, 63? Yeah, 63. This was
That's
so good that, go ahead, sorry.
well, no, I was gonna say it's two full albums, right? Conversations and
Right.
Iron Man, which kind of are predecessors to the big, for in my mind, Out to Lunch. And fortunately, you got the. I won't steal your thunder. Sorry, I just wanted to point that out.
Yeah, no, you're gonna have to fill in on this a little bit because I'll say two things. This was so good that Record Store Day, which we all love and hate equally. They actually released it twice. This is one of the few titles I've ever heard of. They put this back out on a later Record Store Day.
See,
And
that I didn't know.
to your point about Dolphy, this being a predecessor to Out to Lunch, I would say for my rock fans out there, this era is kind of like Pink Floyd's Metal before Dark Side of the Moon. This is kind of like his Metal before Out to Lunch. If I'm sorry, if Out to Lunch is his Dark Side of the Moon, as far as like landmark albums, like these sessions are kind of like the Metal, like that set up for that big splash. So this is a really fun listen. I'm sure you can go on YouTube and people have put the audio up. I should have checked for that actually. And I don't really want to show anything that wasn't accessible, but this is just too good to deny. And I also think that they did do Iron Man as a single release one Record Store Day.
Yeah,
Maybe so
they did.
at
Yeah.
least you can get that. But Dolphy's a guy that I wouldn't start with
Do we
Dolphy.
do we really want to open this can of worms?
Yeah, Dolphy's a guy where it's like when you start to appreciate Coltrane and some of the avant-garde approach of some of these players, and you start to expand a little bit, this is like Dolphy just becomes a rabbit hole. And I know this. I shouldn't even be doing this, guys. This is Jason's guy, right? I just couldn't
Well, no,
resist
I'm
leaving him
glad
off my
he
list.
needed to get brought up. I wasn't even going to go there, like I told you, just because I thought he's going to get his own show, man. Like, how do I just? You can't just show the tip of the iceberg. You got to show the whole thing. But I'm glad you brought him up, and we did talk about
Yeah,
him with Coltrane. Good call. Good call.
yeah,
That is a great way to have those. It's kind of a 2-for-1, right?
yeah,
And I think you nailed it. And I think it's kind of interesting and maybe reaffirming to see that you kind of have the same thought I did, which is, and I've listened to them all. Obviously, I listened to those 3 records specifically because I was going to do a video. I ended up just doing Out to Lunch because the video just didn't make sense. But my feeling after listening to them back to back to back was what you said. It really is kind of, it feels like, and this is going to sound bad. It's going to sound like I don't like those records. They're great, but it almost feels like once you hear Out to Lunch, it's like they're just practicing for Out to Lunch because you got Bobby
yeah,
Hutcherson is there, who just ends up just complete. It's just where they went. It was almost as if the concept of because I really talked about it, even though I cut all this out of my video, I really talked about it as those two records that you just showed leading up to Out to Lunch were more like supporting Dolphy. They feel like Dolphy records where the musicians are just kind of almost creating the rhythm section in a way. Not totally, but when you hear Out to Lunch and you know what Dolphy's intentions were on that record, which is like everyone's a leader. Freddie Hubbard, Anthony Williams, Bobby Hutcherson, and everyone's a leader on this record and pulled it off so well, masterpiece, that then everything else tends to sound a little bit like, yeah, they were just kind of getting it together. Those are great albums, but you kind of alluded to that, where it just kind of feels like it's leading to something bigger, which we got, thank God.
Well, that's the thing, that this is what's so cool about the journey. This is a journey for everybody. It's a journey when you get into an artist. It's a journey when you start collecting records. It's a journey when you just become a music nut and want to stream everything. It's understanding that you actually can listen to an album at the wrong time. And it's always good to go back and revisit things in context, right? Like, and you and I talked about this offline when we were kind of, toying what to discuss. We didn't want to talk about Coltrane and A Love Supreme because we don't think it's a fair entry point for people, because you have to understand where he was going before he got there for a record like that. It's a masterpiece. It is undescribable. It is extremely important to jazz and American culture, but it's not the first Coltrane record I'm going to give somebody who's never listened to jazz before, because it could totally, you could just totally disregard it and write it off. And I think that's like what you're talking about with Out to Lunch, and really most of Dolphy's catalog. I think it's better. It's one of the few artists where I think it actually is great to go chronological with him and build towards that Out to Lunch as like the apex of what he did, right? And it's not to discredit anything else around his catalog, because it's all great, right? But understanding the journey to get to that peak mountain is just it's really fascinating to see. And there's a lot of groups like, and even outside of jazz, like that over history, where it's like if you listen to them out of order sometimes or without any context, it could really ruin your experience. So I have one question for you, if we have time, and I think the gallery has given us some suggestions here, so we don't have to entertain that. I know you love Bobby Hutcherson. I know we're talking about sax players, but did Dolphy get you to Bobby, or did Bobby get you to Dolphy, or is it just coincidence that it came about? I'm always curious about that, because I'm really big on look at the liner notes, find out who these guys are playing with.
In a way, it's kind of coincidental, actually. Dolphy came first for me. Dolphy's a guy that, I discovered 25 years ago, just kind of at that time. And I may have told this story somewhere else, but I used to, there's allmusic.com, the website right now,
right.
All Music. Back in the day, they would have the thick old encyclopedias, and they had one on jazz, All Music Jazz, All Music Jazz, whatever, encyclopedia. I bought that sucker in like 2001 or something like that. And I'm not kidding you, I went through every single page and I just highlighted, and I just and I would go off and listen to the streaming music, and then I would record it and go listen to it throughout the day and stuff. And that's how I learned so much about jazz and musicians, and just uploading all of that information out of that book and then out of the listening. And Eric Dolphy was one of those guys for me. I don't know what it was. It was just so different. And it was such a perfect time. And I must have entered through the perfect record that I wanted to know everything about Eric. And there just wasn't that much information. It's not like there's interviews and stuff. But there's a biography that I read and just loved more about it. And I don't know, there's something about, I hate to say this, but there's almost something that connects us, that makes us yearn more when we hear they died young and we didn't get what we could have got. And so I went through that whole thing. So he was set in stone for me going back, 2001 or whatever. And then Bobby Hutcherson came later. I didn't really connect the dots on him until way later, more recently, and just started listening to, oh my goodness, I'm so sorry. The video is just going to have to do its thing. But, yeah, and then picked up on Bobby later. And once it almost was a thing where I discovered them both in isolation of each other. Even though I was a huge fan of Out to Lunch, I wasn't really connecting those dots per se. And so anyway, Hutcherson came later. And then once I kind of put everything together, it was like, oh, that's another big reason why Out to Lunch sounds the way it does. And then when I did my video on Out to Lunch, I made the statement that Out to Lunch is not Out to Lunch without Bobby Hutcherson. It's just not. He
Yeah.
contributes too much to the sound. He contributes too much to what's going on. And that just sent me down the Bobby Hutcherson rabbit hole. So anyway, it's kind of a long-winded way of how I went through that process.
No, it's a really good story because again, if you just, I think similar to AMG, I used to go with the Rough Guide books. Remember Rough Guide?
Mm.
Great. They actually do some record compilations of like very specific genres. But I always get in the Rough Guide books, or at least going in the bookstore. For the younger people on the stream tonight, they used to actually print books on paper and bind them together, and you could go to a store and buy them. And I think this is why I'm emphatic that you have to look at the liner notes and understand the players, because you're not really going to get Bobby or Eric in a top 10 jazz musicians list. You're just not. And if you don't investigate who's playing with who, you're going to rob yourself of so much stuff. When we talk about even Jackie McLean, you're not going to get it. You're almost not going to get I guess you would get Cannonball, but I'll think of others. But there's so many musicians. Listen, McCoy Tyner, he's going to be on a video about piano when we discuss it, and you're not always getting that as like fed as a top musician. I mean, he's not what I call the Holy Trinity, which is Miles, Coltrane, and Monk, right? He's not going to fit in that as a standalone artist. And then even if you branch out to the next tier of stuff, you're not going to get these guys. So I was curious about your journey there, and it's good that it's coincidental and it makes sense. But I really want people to take away from this discussion that like, look at who's in the band, because all of these guys were leaders at some point before, during, and after when they were featured on everybody else's records. And it's just a really important takeaway to go with.
It's the one music most of all, and you can say outliers in other genres, but it's the one music where there's just so many different combinations. I mean, you've got, like we showed Wayne Shorter, or you probably showed Herbie on like multiple different things just showing up, Ron Carter, and the different combinations that happen. You can say, oh yeah, like I said, when Jackie McLean and Bobby Hutcherson get together, it's special. When Herbie Hancock and Ron Carter get together, it's special. And so it's just all these different combinations, like, twisting a Rubik's Cube, and you can get, it's just so many different things, and it will always sound unique. And so in a way, and even when, for people that aren't really into jazz and it might sound repetitive and stuff like that, the more you get into it, the more you refine your ear to the different musicians and the styles, you really can start to put those different pieces together and see how those combinations fit and really appreciate them in a new way. So where else do you get that besides jazz, really, to the extent, that you get it in jazz?
Yeah, 100%. I think, like, I don't know how many times in my life I've looked at a rock record and I'm like, oh, Mark Knopfler played on this album. It's like not even really like, yeah, it's only a couple of tracks, or like whoever, right? Some really talented Clapton played on this record as a studio musician. Like, you're like, oh, it happens. And it's like kind of a corner case in other genres, but with jazz, it's just a constant. Like, you could make an argument as an example. Let's take Lee Morgan. Just throw away all of his stuff as a leader. He still has a phenomenal catalog as a sideman. It's insane. It's totally, I know we're kind of going around on this idea over and over again, but all these guys as sidemen just stand alone. Like, if that was all they did and left, they would still be one of the greatest, because it's just so good.
And some of them, frankly, are better as sidemen. I hate to say it, and if we don't have to go here tonight, but I mean, I could mention some guys that people that had a lot of records as leaders that people would really stand up to and make the argument that, but they sound better sometimes with others, because not everyone is a great composer. I mean,
that's true.
With jazz, if you really broke it down to its fundamentals and you just said, we can only pick two categories, I'm going to make an argument for, you got the compositions, you got stuff like Bobby Hutcherson, Thelonious Monk, Charles Mingus. These guys are composers.
Mm.
And then you got the soloists. You got the guys that really, there's a vamp. We kick it off with a little ditty or something, you know what I mean? And then we kind of go into the solos and we vibe on the solos, and it kind of goes that way, and you're in and you're out and stuff. They're very solo heavy. They're very dependent sometimes on soloing. But then it's the composers. And for my heart and what I love, and a lot of the stuff I showed today, it's the compositions that I love. I'm much more, and look, I can vibe to solos, of course. There's some great ones, but I love when it's great composing. I love when the whole thing is of a piece, and it's, just go listen to Monk or Mingus or the guys I mentioned. I mean, it's just different. So anyway, I forget how I was just vibing off what you said, but it made me think of that.
Well, I think that's why I picked about
sidemen. Some of these guys actually are really great sidemen.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think you're bringing up a valid point that some of them aren't great leaders, but to your point about the composition, I think that's why I picked my favorite things, as I said earlier, because there's compositions on there that are familiar to people. I also think that's what makes Miles, most of his career, so easy to get into, is that if you look, they're really reinventing standards. And oftentimes when they reinvent these standards, they're the definitive version in my mind. Like, think about Miles as Porgy and Bess. Like, I'm sorry, like most of those tunes now are like he's the version that I think stands up to the test of time. So, there's a lot to be said about the composers and the compositions. Anybody can get on stage and wail. All these guys are super talented, but the ability to actually, make it coherent as a leader, as a sideman, is really what makes them great. And you're right, it lives in the song. It is about the music ultimately. So I got to tell you, I'm really excited for piano. Is that what we're doing next week?
Yeah, I think so, man. It's like,
okay.
I figure saxophone's a great place to start. If you're down with it, let's do piano next time. And, that's going to be an even tougher one, man. We're going to have some real, we're going to have to be on our game.
I think so. So I'm looking forward to it. I think it was a great start, for a great series. Piano next week. Hopefully we get some commentary from the Peanut Gallery. Again, they were great all night. If read some of these comments, we could have a whole show just on their opinions, which is awesome.
Yeah, I love this stuff. All right. Well, that was fun, man. We managed to keep it to a sort of a reasonable time. It's tough. It's just so easy to get so deep into this stuff. Thanks to everyone for joining. Appreciate you. I mean, the plan is to make this a semi-regular thing. Come out here on Monday evenings and do this, and we'd love to see you guys here. We'll make it fun. And I wanted to do a poll today, but I'm still trying to figure out how to do it. I could, a YouTube video I watched that is supposed to walk you through how to do it. I could have to do a little more work, but yeah, we'll make it fun, man. We'll do some fun stuff moving forward, guys. So thank you so much for being here. Really appreciate you guys. Drop a comment, drop a like. That's the best way you can show, that if you like the content. Definitely follow Spins Vinyl if you're not already. And my guy, Chris, he's not there yet. He doesn't have his YouTube, but I know he created the channel. He's where I was, a year and a half ago, creating the channel and just trying to wait, turn the camera on. I want to be there for it, man. Let everybody encourage Chris, man. You did a great job today.
It's always a great time talking to you, Jason. Looking forward to next week, man.
Yeah, me too. All right. Thanks, everybody. We're going to sign out. Thanks for being here. We will see you next week.